This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an Anti-Diet Registered Dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I talk with fellow anti-diet advocates about their journeys toward peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 245 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fellow anti-diet dietitian Anna Lutz about why it doesn't make sense to provide both eating disorder treatment and weight management, the influence of diet culture on parenting, how to provide structure for kids eating without creating a sense of restriction, how to manage picky eating in kids, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. But first, instead of a listener Q&A this week, I have an update on the answer I gave in episode 240, where a listener named Caroline asked if I knew of any stories of people in larger bodies who've had COVID-19 and survived, to help combat all the fear-mongering in the media. Because let's be real, all that fear-mongering has continued even in the wake of racial uprising and the revolution that's happening in this country. There have been story after story still about COVID-19 being caused or exacerbated by higher body weight and that being a risk factor. That narrative is still very much out there. So I want to help push back against that and help those of you listening in larger bodies to allay some of those fears that might still be coming up. And since recording that episode, I learned that two-time past Food Psych guest and plus-size yoga teacher Rachel Estapa had and recovered from COVID-19, and she's been sharing her story with her audience at More to Love Yoga. So I reached out to her to see if she'd be willing to come back on the pod and share that story with all of you, and she was more than happy to. So in just a minute, you'll hear my conversation with Rachel about her experience of having and recovering from COVID-19 in a larger body. And I think it's a really important story to hear if you have any fears lingering about COVID-19 in larger bodies. I'll get back to answering listener questions soon. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me any question you want and have me answer it much more quickly than I can here, you can come check out my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals, where I do a monthly Q&A podcast for course participants that helps you work through the nuances of intuitive eating and get all of your individual questions and concerns answered and addressed so that you can reconnect with the innate wisdom about food and movement that we're all born with and move on to think about more important things in life, move on to direct your attention away from food and body and to the very real world-changing efforts that I know you're here to make. You'll also get hours of teachings about intuitive eating, plus a private community forum just for course participants, so that you can have daily support from me and my team and hundreds of great people who are on this anti-diet path and in the course alongside you. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. It's a great companion to this podcast because it goes into depth about diet culture and all of the ways it harms us and the sneaky ways it shows up in modern life that you might not have realized, with lots of historical context and scientific references and resources to help you learn more. It also lays out the foundation of intuitive eating and helps you start making peace with food in your body. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it. That's christyharrison.com/book. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my first conversation of this episode with Rachel Estapa. So thanks, Rachel, for coming back on. This is a different circumstance than I had hoped to have our next podcast conversation. But I'm also really looking forward to having you tell your story about your experience with COVID-19 and how you got through it, because we've had folks asking. I had a listener question a few weeks ago on the podcast where someone was asking if I knew of anyone in a larger body who'd recovered from this, because they were seeing all this terrifying news and the assumptions being made about larger body people and COVID and the sort of feeling that it was a death sentence or whatever. And so I wanted to see if you'd be willing to tell your story, and you so graciously offered to come on and share, just to kind of help anyone listening understand what it's like to go through COVID, to hear from someone in a larger body who's gone through this. And you're here today to tell your story. So it's amazing. And I'm so grateful for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And going through COVID, going through all of this, it's just to kind of on the outset, this is why me and you believe in body wellness and body acceptance so much. Because for me personally, having this experience of going through COVID and having it for 6 to 7 weeks of like active symptoms, how much I appreciated the experience and the knowledge of body love, because that was just one thing in my arsenal of wellness that I knew I could like rely on, given all of the really vague information from doctors, from people, just the panic around this, to know that I can sift through things and check in with myself. I really think that's the biggest lesson that hopefully I can impart upon other people, whether or not you get COVID or not, like there are still lessons for all of us in this.
I love that. And yeah, I was really struck by, in your piece that you wrote about this, which we'll link to in the show notes for this episode, you talked about how COVID was such a test of all the body acceptance work that you had done to this point, and you felt like you aced it. And I'm so excited to hear more about that, of how you felt that body acceptance work supported you through this experience. But let's start at the beginning of just kind of like when the symptoms came on and sort of the early stages of getting this disease. What was it like for you?
Sure. So for context, I'm in Boston, just outside of Boston, and we're sort of like right behind New York. We were sort of the hub for a little bit. My symptoms started in like maybe early mid-March, and very innocuous. Like the first symptom I had was like, I felt like a burning in my chest. And the only reason why I thought to notice it or like note it, because whenever I have colds in the past, I always get bronchitis. So I knew that like, okay, something's going on with my chest. And I'll be honest, I was in total denial to start. I was like, no way, this is a cold. Like I've been doing all of the things, like I'm washing my hands, all the protocols, right? And gradually symptoms would start to pile on. Like first it was the chest, then my nose got stuffy. Then I started to just not feel well. But it wasn't this like huge impact. Like I think a lot of us assume that a disease like this is like one day you wake up, kind of like how with the flu and the cold, like one day you wake up and you have it. This one for me took, I would say 2 to 3 weeks really to sort of figure out that like, okay, this isn't just something seasonal or the cold or a cold. And the more and more and more that symptoms started to roll in for me, the more and more scared I got. And also my husband at the same time was getting sick too, but his symptoms were almost completely different than mine. He had the traditional breathing issues, shortness of breath, the cough, the dry cough, the other stuff. I didn't have those off the bat. So the more and more that I was tuning into, press conferences and trying to filter like what's going on here, I knew. I mean, from the get-go, I knew I had it. I just knew. And I know that sounds weird, but I think like it's not crazy because I've been so steeped in body acceptance. Like we've had colds, we've had flus, we've had this, we've had that. This one was different. And the fact that it came in waves, the symptoms would change almost every couple days, But the worst part of it really was the sense of like huge inflammation in my body, on top of breathing, on top of just feeling sick, then this radiating pain. And like literally, like my fingernails hurt and my earlobes hurt. And I was afraid to go to the doctor for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, would they take me seriously being a larger body? Right. Like, and I think that's something that happens, unfortunately, for so many people in larger bodies, that going to the doctor or going to seek care, it isn't just as simple as walking into some place. There's so much energy, mental, physical, sort of like armor that we have to put on. And to be honest, in crisis, I just didn't have I was like, I don't have enough energy to think about this right now. And I know that that sounds paradoxical, but for people that understand what I mean by like so much mental and emotional energy just to even like make an appointment with your doctor, that was a huge thing. And the other thing was, and this is just the luck of the universe, I was in a gap of health insurance. So here I was, the sickest I have ever been, and I didn't have health insurance. And so I called my doctor because my symptoms kept getting like more and more severe. And then my fever started to spike, like 102, 103. And that was going on for a couple of days. And I was like, I have to do this. I have to call because this is just, I can't play this or ride this out. Thankfully, the respiratory clinic at Mass General Hospital, they took me right away. It was a very surreal experience because, one, I couldn't bring anyone with me. Not that I wanted to, but even just that sense of like someone waiting in the car with you, or just knowing that no one could come, not even into the parking lot. Had to have a mask on. And, all the doctors were suited up, just like a movie. It looked like a movie. And things were taped off. There were like tape on the floor to guide people. The spaces were set apart. And I was in the waiting room for a little bit. And thankfully, after my exam, which was like the weirdest doctor exam I've ever had, because they didn't touch you, even though like they're testing like your lungs and everything. They're like, okay, well, you don't have pneumonia. You're not showing labored signs of breathing distress, even though I didn't have whatever flagged them to send people into the hospital. But let's get you a swab because, let's see what's going on. And within less than a day, that came back positive. And then after that test, for those, I would say for 4 days was the sickest I have ever been in my life. And I'm just thinking about it even now, I definitely haven't even integrated the whole experience, because even just thinking about it, it sort of feels like that happened to a different person, because I couldn't see my family. I couldn't see my parents who just live, 15 miles away, my friends. It was me and my husband cooped up in our apartment, and now both of us are sick. It was a very rough period on the physical level, but also on the emotional level and the mental and the spiritual level. Just like, oh my God, what is going on? And how do I manage something that really is not in my control right now? I can control something up until a point, right? But no one really knows what is going on. It was a trial of self-health as best I could. Like you had said earlier on, now that I'm past it, I feel like I did so well. When I was in it, absolutely not. I don't think I was yeah. When I was in it, I was not this optimistic as I am. Of course, everything is, hindsight 2020, as I say.
Right. You're just doing your best to get through it at the time, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That sounds so isolating too. It sounds like you were so cut off from everyone else, and it was just you and your husband in this little bubble trying to fight for your lives, trying to survive.
It was isolating. And I think that isolation's been magnified so much for everyone that, all of a sudden your world is now condensed to whatever your house looks like, wherever you're living. And those scenarios in and of themselves might not even be good scenarios for you to be in, right? Thankfully, I have a nice neighborhood, and people here in where I live in Boston, were taking it extremely seriously from the minute we knew that oh my gosh, we need to do something about this. So that was beneficial. But I felt, and I haven't seen this too much because the survivor stories are kind of trickling out. But I was like, is this the thing that's going to stigmatize me now for the rest of my life? Is this a thing that, how are people going to view having this? So all that judgment around health, right? In a different setting, but the same things around that. We judge people for their body. We judge people. How could you let this happen to you? Just like the way that we think about disease and how much that impacts you when you're living living through it or even talking about it. I was really afraid to tell people about it at first because I was afraid of the stigma. I was afraid of people judging it, and that's my own internal stuff, but I was able to lean on my body acceptance work. One of the core things that I've learned and try to impart with More to Love's work is that you do not have to apologize for being honest. Like, honesty is body acceptance. Like, where you are at, what you're experiencing, you don't have to judge that. You don't have to have anyone else's approval or spin on that. Like, you're allowed to own that and have that relationship. And I really was like, this is about me. This is about my experience, and I'm allowed to share that. And I'm allowed to do that in a way that maybe it helps other people, maybe it doesn't. But in reality, it was for me. My own sense of wellness was being able to share and talk about the experience.
And that is such a powerful antidote to the isolation and also to the self-stigmatization. Because I think when you internalize that stigma and you put it on yourself and keep yourself from sharing it, it doesn't allow you to connect with people who might understand and empathize and support you. It keeps you stuck. It keeps you isolated.
It does. And that's a spiral. And I always say this, shame is sticky. It will stick to anything. It doesn't care if it's your body, if it's disease, if it's, your social like, it doesn't matter what it is. Shame is sticky. But the way to dismantle shame is to integrate those pieces that need to be felt. And, when I could do everything I could, taking Advil, taking all of these things, I could only go so far. And then I turned to my yoga. Then I turned to my wellness practices. Then I turned to the internal relationship that I've spent so long repairing and trusting in. And at the peak of it, I honestly didn't do anything, quote unquote, for like 4 days, except I was like meditating and trying to literally sense every part of my body. Like, I was doing body scans nonstop as a way to say to myself, like, this isn't happening to me, I'm participating in it. Like, this practice of observing pain in your body and being a witness to it rather than being caught up in it. And that's a skill, right? That takes time to do that. And I'm glad that I had spent those years in the past, because when it came to it, I could be there without getting so caught up emotionally that then I was adding more misery or more pain to the situation.
Yeah, that makes total sense. You weren't disconnecting from your body and blaming it and shaming it for what it was going through. You were there with your body as a part of it.
Yeah. And that was really the message that I got back from listening to my body. Like, although, when we get symptoms, symptoms in our body, it's not a bad thing. Like, I know that I'm having inflammation because that's my body's healing response. I know that my lungs are having a struggle because they're under siege. And what will that help my body do its job for me? And that's a mindset thing. That's, one of those things that we have to practice trial by trial. And sometimes we have moments that, like, that's the lesson. That was sort of the big test for me. Is like, how are you going to handle being miserable and sick, but not blaming yourself for it, not turning it into a sense of helplessness. And not that it's bad to, but like, I knew that if I went down that road, it wouldn't get me through where I needed to be right now, because I have that idea, that perspective that, like, what can I learn right now? Like, what am I learning right now? What am I learning right now? And that's really what I focused in on.
And that's such a powerful thing and such a hard thing to do in this culture that always tells you otherwise, right? As someone in a larger body with all the rhetoric that's swirling around about COVID, I can imagine that feeling like you have inflammation throughout your body. That's such a buzzword, right? Inflammation. Oh no, it's the bugbear. It's like you have to do something to, or fatness causes inflammation. That's like the new ridiculous line that's coming out of a lot of researchers' mouths, even though they don't actually understand it, or, that's totally speculation.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can imagine that going through that experience and having this culture drip those messages in, you had to really fight back. And the work that you had done for so many years already to fight back was helpful in that too.
Yeah. I mean, I from early on, I saw the terminology that, larger bodies and all of the medical, I won't say the words, but the medical descriptors that go along with it. There was just this switch in me that could filter it pretty quickly, knowing that it's the same stuff that gets regurgitated and is just not essential in the moment, right? Like, I didn't want to fall for that again, especially now. And I know that I have the privilege and the luxury to be able to do that. Not everyone has that ability to not blame our body fat for everything and the doctors XYZ. When I was in the hospital, no one said anything. Like in my actual experience from my first call to my primary care to my last phone call with a public health officer from my town, not once did a question of weight come up. Not once. Not once of body size. Now I do live in Massachusetts. We're a very progressive state on that. Like I'm part of legislature in Massachusetts to help make body size one of the language terms to add to, like, you can't discriminate based on things. So there's a lot of that awareness here in Boston, but I know that that's not I'm in the exception where that is not the norm in the rest of the country, if not the world. But that made me feel better that people in the healthcare profession were actually genuinely looking at this as a serious thing to help the person rather than blaming your lifestyle or blaming your body size. If that helps anyone feel like they shouldn't worry about that, because I didn't experience that in the cycle of care.
That is huge. I mean, and I think you're right that that's not the case everywhere, and that, depends on where you are and what hospital system or healthcare provider you happen to stumble into. And some of them are more fat phobic than others, certainly. But I think it's so helpful to know that in this more progressive part of the world where people are mindful, maybe more mindful about weight stigma, they weren't bringing that up. They weren't stigmatizing you, and they were just focusing on getting you the care you needed, which sounds like you were even able to manage without being admitted to the hospital. You just were able to do it from home and have telemedicine for the most part, other than the diagnosis.
Yeah. And I really, if my suggestion is to anyone that is concerned about symptoms, call your doctor, call your state, your town. This is the time where turning to local leaders is going to be more productive. Not to get too political, but on the national level, abysmal. Like even the Center for Disease Control, which is established exactly for these types of scenarios, doesn't have their stuff together. So this is why the relationship between us and our primary care givers and our health workers is so important. So I really hope that this becomes an opportunity, at least for people in larger bodies and in all bodies, to get that trust back. Like I'm an eternal optimist. Like I'll always see things that way. But call up your doctor and say, hey, I've got this going on. What should I do? What should be the next steps? Because the more that you can take a preventive action in your symptoms rather than letting it wait. Like I think I waited too long because I was also in denial. Like I should have gone to the doctor probably a week earlier than I actually did.
And it sounds like you were scared too.
Oh, I was terrified.
You're scared of experiencing fat phobia. You're scared of...
I was afraid of dying.
Yeah.
I was afraid of dying, and I was afraid of not being able to see my parents. And honestly, I was afraid of how am I going to tell the mortal of community that, sorry, Rachel's gone. I know that that's like a very extreme thing, but it's not. Not when you don't have a knowledge of like, what's this virus capable of? What's my body? What's the threshold for my body, right? Like so many people are, and that's what was scary, is that our immune systems in younger people, younger, quote unquote, healthier people, are so good that they're actually causing the harm, right? Like all of the symptoms and these distresses from an overactive immune response. I was afraid of that. And there's only one way to go, is through it. So I'm glad that did not happen. I'm so happy that I'm healthier, both my husband and I. If I can share any wisdom, thoughts, just my experience to help, I'm going to do it in any facet of life.
I love that. And thank you so much for sharing your story. Are you feeling totally better now? Are there still any lingering symptoms that you're having? Or
I definitely have post-viral fatigue, and that might take a few months to clear up, meaning that like I don't have the same energy level that I did beforehand. And that could be for a multitude of reasons. I mean, this is a stressful time for everyone, whether or not you get COVID or coronavirus, like it doesn't matter. Like this is a shock on the individual level, the family, community, all the way up to the top. So that affects our energy. There's only so much we can think about and react to. So that's a factor. The other thing that I've noticed too is my taste and smell aren't as rich as they used to be, which stinks because I love food. So I would say that my taste buds and smell, which is one of the symptoms of COVID, like you have no smell or taste. It's very weird to really have nothing. That's not back. And my stomach, unfortunately, has not been happy. I don't know if it's from the acute inflammation that I had. It's just, I can feel, it feels like my insides are still healing from it. But on the plus side, which is kind of cool, like I bit my tongue or I bit my lip not too long ago, like a couple of weeks ago, like really badly. And usually a gash like that would take like a week or so to clear up. It was gone in less than 2 days. So my system is like firing on all cylinders. So that's kind of a plus that I was like, okay, I got my taste buds back kind of, and I can enjoy food now.
That's very cool.
Yeah. We don't know what the long term is. My husband got an antibody test. His came back that he has, the stuff for antibodies, which is great. Mine is scheduled for a couple weeks. So hopefully that's a good thing. And then from there, we'll try to do, the plasma to help, move a vaccine, move any kind of healing stuff for other people along. But it's been a wild ride. And then also having to shift my whole business because I teach yoga classes in person. So now I've essentially had to, now that all my classes are virtual and managing an online community and how different that is on just interacting with people. So it's been a really big month, 2 months, 3 months for all of us. Like it isn't just me, like all of us are making it happen. And like, I just think about, I look at history, like horrible things happen and people find a way, right? Like that's the amazing part about us, I think, as humans, that there is this, how quickly we can adapt, even though our minds say this is impossible, like there's no way I can do this. And then even just like for yourself, look back to January, like it feels like a different world, right? And how much you've like figured out like our new routine, our new rhythm. That is the heart of body acceptance. It's facing what is true for you, and it's using the tools and the resources that are available to you, the inside resources and the outside resources to help you move along. Like wellness is not a static point. It's always going to ebb and flow. And I think so many of us are really seeing what that looks like to have balance again in our lives, believe it or not. Like some people love quarantine. Some people, I think that this is totally what I needed, like just like a reset of my life. Like that is a very valid thing. And for other people, it's the complete opposite. So it really depends on how are you checking in with yourself and what are the realities that some things you can change, some things you can't change, but just being respectful of the collective health, right? Collective well-being, collective participation, and making sure that we do our part. And that's, with yoga, if you practice yoga, like you've heard the term namaste, right? And namaste really means like the light in me honors and respects the light in you. Like wearing a mask is a version of namaste as far as I'm concerned.
Yes. Oh.
That's all it is. It's just respecting other people's well-being or hopes for their well-being. Like that is really all we're asking. Just, it's it. I will end my political rant there.
I love that. I'm always here for a political rant and always here for you. And so grateful that you were able to get through this and with your body acceptance practice, not only intact, but stronger than ever, it sounds like, and to come through it with such a sense of communal care and respect for others is just really inspiring. So thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Thank you so much for letting me share it.
And can you tell us, for anyone who doesn't know, where to find you online and learn more about your work?
Yeah. So you can find me over at moretoloveyoga.com. And I've got online virtual classes that you can join us live, and also they're recorded, so you can sign up and watch those at any time. And I've got some other online tutorials on how to make yoga work for your home. And, this is like a whole new area of opportunity for wellness practitioners. Like, how can we make it easier for us to practice wellness within our own homes? Because we don't know how long things are going to be this way, but we don't have to wait, right? We don't have to wait for the conditions to be perfect in order for us to be well. So I'm really trying to make More to Love meet everyone where they really are at, on the computer, teaching people how to make your own little yoga space at home, supplies, the community aspect. So More to Love Yoga has got all the goods on that.
I love it. We'll put links to that in the show notes as well, and include also the piece you wrote about your COVID-19 experience. And thank you again so much for sharing your story and being here.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Rachel Estapa for sharing all of that with us. And I'm so grateful that she's feeling better now after that whole COVID ordeal. Now we'll go to the main interview for this episode, which is with fellow anti-diet dietitian Anna Lutz, talking about how to raise kids to have a peaceful relationship with food and develop resilience and resistance to diet culture, and so much more. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
Well, I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a upper middle class family in the suburbs. And we had family dinners every night, ate kind of Southern American food. And really my only kind of memory around food and body stuff is being teased for having a somewhat larger body compared to my peers. Kind of one memory I have is a soccer coach kind of making comments about my stomach. But I never associated that with my food, which I really think is probably means my parents never associated weight with food, which is interesting to me, kind of looking backwards.
How lucky, too, that you didn't have that association.
Yeah. And, of course, as I became a teenager and went to college, that changed. Another kind of interesting memory I have is I think I must have been in 4th or 5th grade when my cholesterol was checked. I think that is right when cholesterol started being checked for children, for kind of all children. And my cholesterol numbers came back high. And I remember my parents just saying, oh, we're not going to worry about that. We eat a very balanced diet and that's not a big deal. We'll just kind of see what happens. And so the next time it was checked, it was within normal limits. And I remember the nurse really asking me, what did you do to get these numbers down? We want to tell all the children what you did. And I remember just looking at her and not knowing how to answer because I thought I would be in trouble if I said I didn't do anything different. And I didn't really have an answer. I just kind of stared at her. But I think about that when I think about dietitians now working with children and how things have really changed. And we really kind of have to swing back to maybe how things used to be.
Yeah, the fact that your parents weren't even concerned about it and just, dismissed it as maybe a fluke. And it seems like it was because on repeat testing, it was normal again. So
right.
That's interesting and does square with a lot of evidence that numbers and levels of different things can kind of fluctuate. And sometimes it's just like, who knows? Who knows why it was high that time?
Exactly. And I think that kind of experience has affected how I work with children. And we can get to that later. But just this notion that I think there's so much pressure on parents now to parent and feed in a certain way and kind of the harm that can cause.
Yeah, so much pressure. Oof.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that didn't really interfere too much, though, in your relationship with food.
It didn't. Like I said, I had a family that we ate lots of family meals together, ate a variety of food. I wasn't too aware of diet culture, honestly, until I went off to college, which I think is interesting to me because I'm sure I knew people in high school that had an eating disorder that were dieting, but I must have been oblivious to it, honestly, because I didn't know that, which means I was pretty sheltered.
Right. Well, and it sounds like you had a really positive model in your family, too, where they were just not concerned about that stuff and there was no pressure. Even when the soccer coach said that thing about your stomach, was it sort of like because there was no pressure in the home for you to try to change your body, it just didn't feel like a thing you needed to worry about?
I think so. I think I kind of share that experience because I think it had some effect on me. I think I kind of was aware that my body was kind of not this quote unquote ideal, but it then wasn't reinforced, like you're saying, in my home of like, okay, well, let's do something about that or let's change it. It was more, I can't believe that person said that to you. So it was, I'm a fairly sensitive person, so I think it affected me in some way, but I think my experience and my relationship with food could have been really different if it had been reinforced by the people that were closer to me.
And I think that's helpful to know too, in terms of parenting and ways in which diet culture infiltrates people's minds so young. Kids get exposed to it so young. But I think if the parents can be kind of a bulwark against it, sometimes that can really help kids be resilient and not get sucked in.
Absolutely. When I think the opposite is our current culture, which is more saying, okay, parents, this is your job to make sure your children have a certain body type and that they eat certain types of food. And there's a lot of guilt and shame for parents if they don't do that.
Right. As though it reflects on them and their parenting skills, which is totally not true. It doesn't.
Right. And I, again, could be naive, but I don't think there was that amount of pressure on parents, in the 70s when I grew up. It's heightened and heightened and heightened over the last 30, 40 years.
Absolutely. I mean, in researching the history of diet culture for my book, I found that really was true. That the 70s diet culture started to reach this fever pitch for adults anyway, for pressuring adults to lose weight and count calories, and sort of more and more adults of various walks of life than ever before were dieting. But it didn't really have that pressure on kids. I didn't see evidence of childhood O word as the supposed scourge that it is today. I feel like that really started to come into play in the 90s and early 2000s.
Yes. When I was studying nutrition, that was really kind of the height of when I was at the School of Public Health.
Well, I'm so interested to hear how you got there. How did you get attracted to nutrition and public health in the first place?
So I went off to school, to a school that kind of a high achieving school. And suddenly I was around people that it was very overt that were dieting. And there was a very narrow definition of what a body was supposed to look like. And I remember being a first year student and kind of being perplexed by why people were eating the way they were eating. It was kind of the height of the low fat craze. And it was mostly the women on the campus were eating just certain foods for dinner. And I was kind of perplexed at first, to be honest with you. And then I had some friends, some close friends who had an eating disorder. And I just kind of became interested in why we all eat the way we do, and what were those influences, that why some people went away to college and ate in this very, very particular way, and why other people didn't. And it wasn't that culture didn't affect them. So I studied psychology with kind of this focus on what influences how we eat, and decided to go on to study nutrition. And so when I went to the School of Public Health here in North Carolina, I went into it with the hopes of working with people with eating disorders.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because I feel like I don't hear as many people go into public health from that perspective. And God knows we could use so much more of a focus on eating disorders and disordered eating prevention in public health in that field.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'll be honest with you that the main reason I went to study nutrition at UNC was because it was my state school and it was a really good school. And so at the time, I saw it very separate. I was going and I was having to take these kind of public health classes that were focused on the O word. And I was very interested in eating disorders. So I did lots of independent studies and work on the side about eating disorders. And through my kind of evolution as a dietitian is kind of seeing the damage that we do when we keep that separate.
And so interesting too that it was focused on the O word and you're sort of doing your own thing off to the side. But I noticed in your bio that you have a master's in public health nutrition. That's the concentration. And that's what my master's is in too. It's also a public health nutrition concentration. And I'm so curious about when public health nutrition even became a thing, because,
right.
I feel like it really actually was born around the time that concern for the O word and the labeling of body size as an epidemic came on the scene. I don't know if public health was that interested in nutrition before that.
I think you're probably right. I think that's really interesting that these departments in schools of public health are fairly new, I think, but I'd have to do some research.
Yeah, I know the one where I went, NYU, was started by Marion Nestle, who's a food politics person, who wrote the book Food Politics. And so that her focus has always been body size as an epidemic. And I'm curious how that played into the development of this public health nutrition concentration there and at other schools across the country.
That's really interesting.
You studied public health nutrition. Did that O-word epidemic language and rhetoric filter in at all to the work you were doing with eating disorders or to your, because you also pursued the dietitian license. So I'm assuming you had to do like the dietetics classes and the basic DPD classes, the coursework for the registered dietitian license. So I'm just curious how that melded together in your mind.
Yes. Well, it's kind of interesting to look back on, and I certainly have cringe moments when I look back on some of the work I did early on, where one of my classes was creating a grant that focused it on childhood O-word, that was part of what I did. And I don't feel like, just looking back, it wasn't so overt to me how contrary to my true interest this was. And really, it wasn't until early in my career, I worked at Children's National Medical Center in DC, and I was their outpatient dietitian. And so one day a week, I was at an outpatient eating disorder clinic. And the other days of the week, I was at different just general nutrition outpatient clinics around the DC area. So one day a week, I felt like I was practicing in one way. And then in the other days of the week, there was this concern from doctors about children's weight. And lucky enough, my supervisor there, right when I started, before I started, said I needed to read Ellen Satter's books. I think I was exposed to Ellen Satter's work minimally in school, but reading her books honestly kind of started bridging that we need to be practicing. The harm that we cause is great when we treat one person one way because of their weight and another person another way. And so, I couldn't fully practice from a weight inclusive perspective there. And I was very new in my career, but I feel like that was kind of my beginning into really thinking about things differently.
That's so interesting because I feel like Ellen Satter is someone that people don't really get exposed to unless they're going to be doing work around pediatric feeding. So was that a focus of this work that you were doing and the supervisor who recommended it to you?
Yes, because I was only seeing children in these clinics. So it was all childhood feeding and, whether it was picky eaters or different other things going on. And then very quickly, I started to feel like, and I'll be honest with you, I think I kind of felt I could kind of relate to these young children who were being sent because something was quote wrong with them. I think I thought back on on me as a child being told my cholesterol was wrong or my stomach was too big or these things. And I could relate to these children and think I'm in a position where I could really help this family to be protective for their child, or I could really cause a lot of harm, which is what Ellen Satter writes about, was she kind of felt that way early in her career.
Yeah, that's so sad and so unfortunate that so many kids do get harmed that way by dietitians.
Yes.
And the dietitians don't really know any better, right? Because we're not really taught about this stuff in school.
Exactly.
What was that like for you when you started reading Ellen Satter's work? And for people who don't know, who are listening, because we've talked about it on the podcast a number of times, but for anyone who's new, can you just kind of give an overview of what that philosophy looks like?
Probably the most pertinent thing about what we're talking about is that she really believes that with young children, we need to be working directly with the parents, that it's really confusing and not developmentally appropriate for us to be working directly with young children. So if you have a 7, 8-year-old and you're talking to them about that they need to be eating certain foods and these foods are better than other foods and these numbers are quote healthy, not healthy, that's just from a developmental perspective young children can't process that. And I would even venture to say a lot of us adults can't process that. But young children are concrete thinkers. And so they try to process abstract concepts like nutrition is there's lots of abstract concepts in nutrition, but young children will try to make sense of it. And it can fall into this very black and white, this is good or this is bad. And that can lead to restrictive eating, all sorts of different things, just fear around food. And so that's kind of a big part of kind of what I took away from that. And then those concepts very much was how I was working with people with eating disorders. Another big piece of her work is the division of responsibility in feeding. So really letting parents do the parents' jobs, children do the child's jobs. So the parents' jobs are to decide when, what, and where. it's 6 o'clock, it's time for dinner, and this is what we're having for dinner. And then to take a deep breath and let your child decide if they're going to eat and how much. That's really their job. So when we start to talk to kids directly about eating certain foods and not other foods, it just doesn't make sense. Children don't go to the grocery store, they don't put together meals, really to think about what's developmentally appropriate for them.
I think that's so important and helpful. And I hadn't actually heard, I haven't read up on Ellen Satter as much as I've more the Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch camp of intuitive eating and haven't done as much work with pediatric feeding. So I hadn't even heard that Ellen Satter had this idea of like what is developmentally appropriate for the age. But it makes so much sense because kids are such black and white thinkers. And I've seen so many people who are adolescents or adults thinking back on their childhood, thinking about how their eating disorder and disordered eating came on. And it was around this sort of creation of black and white rules that they had interpreted something they heard from, a parent or a doctor or a dietitian or like nutrition classes at school and turned them into these black and white rules. And I think those nutrition classes at school do such harm because these poor kids really are not able to get their heads around these concepts. And more schools and providers need to hear this message that, it really is not developmentally appropriate to talk to kids about nutrition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That when, we're talking to young children about nutrition, it needs to be about where does food come from? Let's plant some seeds. Or just this week, my son in 4th grade here in North Carolina, they start teaching about nutrition. And so I'm always the first to email the teacher and ask what they're going to be teaching about nutrition. But she luckily is allowing me to do a lesson. It'll be virtual, but we're going to be just learning about the parts of the plant. And we eat the flower of the plant, we eat the fruit, we eat the stem, we eat the roots. And there needs to be no kind of moral or hierarchy. Just these are the facts. This is what we eat. And that's how people grow up to be competent eaters, is they just learn about food.
Thinking about food from that perspective too, of like kind of the miracle of it, the fact that it grows from seeds in the soil and how that process happens and like the different parts that we eat. I feel like that creates a sense of like wonder and excitement and agency around food that's so different from the black and white, good, bad food rules that are created inadvertently by so many nutrition classes.
Exactly. And then, I just think back, I say this a lot, the current generation of children are getting the biggest kind of impact, I think, of all this, quote, fear around weight and the O word. That when I was little, that was just, we didn't have nutrition lessons like that in public schools. But these young children right now, and in the last 10, 15 years, are getting just everywhere they go, they get all this rhetoric around healthy, unhealthy foods and weight. And I just feel for them. But I think hopefully us as the adults can really start to shift that for them.
I so hope so, because I feel like we're just going to see a tidal wave of disordered eating and eating disorders, if not.
Exactly. It's very concerning.
And there is data now showing an uptick in the levels of eating disorders, even in the last 20 years since the O-word epidemic rhetoric started to become really prevalent. And really is so fascinating to see that direct, obviously correlation is not causation. We can't tell for sure what caused it, but I think it's very likely, very, very likely that what caused this is this rampant rhetoric around body size and equating larger bodies to a disease.
Yes, exactly.
It's so infuriating.
Yes, it is.
How did your practice change with the kids that you worked with after learning about Ellen Satter's work?
Like I said, I was a new dietitian when I worked in DC, and the way it was set up was usually the child would come in with the parents for the nutrition consultation. And there's some rules about insurance with that, but I would, anytime I could, have the parent come in by themselves and really focus on the parent support around all this and translate growth charts for parents. So often, part of this whole focus on weight has been these very arbitrary cutoffs on growth charts that deem children, quote, at risk. but really looking at a child's growth history really can tell us so much more. So I felt like I was doing a lot of educating parents and reassuring them of what was going on with their child's growth rather than kind of feeding into the fear of what was going on. But I also wasn't perfect. I really still had a whole lot to learn. And I continue to evolve now.
Yeah, as we all do.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think the HACE movement has taken Ellen Satter's work even further. Ellen Satter doesn't identify as a HACE practitioner, and so not all of her concepts are based in the health at every size principles, but there's a lot of really important work there that she's done.
For people who are sort of navigating this as practitioners and providers, or even just consumers, like finding this information online, how do you read Ellen Satter's work like through a HAES lens? What are some kind of things that you would recommend, like the things that we want to maybe hold on to, or the things that can be sort of tweaked to be a little more flexible in the model versus like what do we need to kind of just put aside and say, this is a relic of not being fully aligned with HAES?
Yeah. I would say there's probably maybe just some language in her books that we've kind of moved past. I think the theories and the heart of it is very much congruent, but also that weight changes, if a child is kind of plodding along on their growth curve and there is a significant weight change up or down off of their growth curve, just to remember it could be an indication that something is going on, and it could not. It just to be curious about it, that it doesn't mean something good or bad is going on. It just might be an indication that there's been some behavior change, but that every individual grows differently, and we can use these models or growth charts to help us, but it's not definitive. So that's probably my biggest advice.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
How did your own career start to evolve then towards the HAES model, and where did you kind of find that get locked into HAES?
So after I worked in DC, I moved back home to North Carolina, and I worked at the Duke eating disorder. I was on the eating disorder team through student health at Duke University. And so there I worked with college-age people, mostly working with people with eating disorders. Through that work, it felt almost like a relief that I wasn't at Children's. I was getting all these referrals from doctors who are concerned about people's weight, and they were children. So it was the parents and the doctors that were worried. When I was at student health, these were adults that were coming in because they were concerned about something. And most of the clients I saw, they had some kind of disordered eating. Some people were self-referred because they had concerns about their own weight. But I practiced at that point from a non-diet approach. I'm not sure I knew about HACE at that point, to be honest with you. But I was able to kind of really felt like I could practice more in a congruent way, not practicing one way with one client and another way with another, that I could really find the way I was going to practice in general. I was there for a few years, and then I started working in private practice and really started to learn about health at every size. And working from a HACE perspective really felt like that answer to the frustration I felt about that people either treated eating disorder clients with this philosophy, which was all foods fit, there are no good food, bad foods, there's size diversity, all these wonderful things that eating disorder dietitians teach and believe. But then there was this other way that if you worked with other people, you use these other philosophies. And HACE really felt like the answer of, I'm going to practice from a HACE perspective no matter what. And what if we all dietitians, whether you identify as an eating disorders dietitian or not, what if we all practice from this perspective, what good we could do in the world and what harm we could avoid?
I agree. I think I started when I was first starting to work in eating disorders, it was very much this idea of like, okay, here's the best practices for eating disorder recovery. Here's how I treat my clients with eating disorders. But then if someone comes in wanting to lose weight and they don't have an eating disorder, then I guess I should still help them. Like it was just this very like, what do I do here? And I feel like Hays and intuitive eating were the way of sort of bridging that and like answering that question of like, actually, no, you don't have to do anything different with someone who comes in wanting to lose weight. You still work with them on their relationship with food. You still help them, make peace with their body. You still help them with an all foods fit approach. And same with someone who comes in with diabetes, and same with someone who comes in with heart disease, and same with someone who comes in with multiple sclerosis. Like all of it can work within this model.
Absolutely. And that this model is supported by the evidence that focusing on behaviors and in a weight inclusive way is what leads to health, if that's what the client is coming to you for.
How did you first discover Hays?
That's a great question. I don't know if I know exactly. My guess it would be from attending eating disorder conferences, being on listservs for dietitians who treat eating disorders. And at first, I remember learning about Hays. I don't think I fully kind of identified as Hays. I didn't market myself in that way. And then once I started my own practice, which now has been about 5 years ago, I was really clear that that is how I wanted to market myself and my practice. And it just has felt so, just being kind of true to who I am and true to the work I do. But I wish I remembered kind of that first introduction I had to Hays, and I don't.
I definitely feel like conferences and listservs and being exposed to it through eating disorder practitioners was like the thing that really made it clear to me that Hays was an important tool in the toolbox for everything dietitians do.
Yes.
I weirdly had the seed planted for me like 10 years ago with a journalist colleague that I was working with at the time who happened to be interested in Hays and practice from a Hays approach in terms of like, his writing about these issues and body size and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was fascinating because, I was tapped to guest edit this package on Childhood O Word because at the time I was studying that in school and writing about that as a journalist and all about it, So he was like, okay, well, at least I can kind of work with this friend and try to convince her over to the Hays side, basically, I think was maybe some of his reasoning.
Oh, that's really neat.
Yeah. So, I did, he like recommended several books. I bought Health at Every Size. I bought Lessons from the Fatosphere. I bought the Fat Studies Reader. And then those all sat on my shelf for a couple of years. I was like not ready for them, But then when I started working with eating disorders and started hearing about that stuff at conferences and seeing Hays discussed as a best practice for eating disorder treatment, I was like, oh, I guess I should probably go read those books. This is actually has a good evidence base. It's not just this thing that this one friend was, happened to be interested in.
Right. Well, I think that's pretty amazing that someone from journalism introduced it to you. That's really cool.
It is. I know. It's so cool because it shows like how it's gotten out there. It's gotten kind of into the mainstream consciousness in some way, even back then. This was like 2009 or something.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. So how did it go from there for you then in terms of your practice and your alignment with Hays?
When my business partner, Sean Alexander, and I started our practice, we were very set on advertising as a Hays practice, and any of the dietitians who work here would have that same philosophy, that we wouldn't do any kind of focus on weight as part of our practice. And so honestly, that has just been an amazing thing. It's attracted really wonderful dietitians that are really grounded in the Hays principles. And we have, dietitians who focus on eating disorders and others that don't, but it's really neat to have this kind of shared common ground that we're kind of rooted in these principles. So, it's really kind of felt like a coming into your own kind of thing.
I love that. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Especially that, it's Hays private practice for nutrition that doesn't just focus on eating disorders and disordered eating, but also all kinds of other concerns that might bring people looking for a nutritionist or dietitian, and offers this perspective that is very antithetical to a lot of what they would find out there that might be harmful.
Yes. And I just think it's been a wonderful thing it's almost once you start to kind of just advertise yourself as this is what we do, then you attract the clients who need you and who want to work with you. It's been a really neat thing. And we've always, part of our practice has always been the family, a piece of it has always been the family feeding piece. And so working with parents of young children around any kind of eating concerns. And so we have felt strongly about that being a part of our practice because I think there's a preventative part of it, that I don't at all think that parents cause eating disorders. I also think how food and bodies are talked about in homes can be protective. And so it's important to me to have that kind of family feeding piece as part of our practice.
Yeah, that's so huge. I do think that's a really important piece of prevention of eating disorders in the next generation and heading them off at the pass before people have to come in for treatment of them if we can prevent them in the first place. That's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
What are you seeing right now? Because we're talking in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, I think people are expressing a lot of anxiety about being home and being around food so much and also having food scarcity. And I think it's triggering on many levels for people's pre-existing disordered eating and just diet culture beliefs that are getting really stirred up by this whole pandemic. What are you seeing in regards to that with family feeding with people who have kids?
Well, I think there's so much information just kind of swirling around the internet of how we should be feeding our families during this time. And what worries me the most is so much of it is based in this fear of weight changes, fear of not being a good parent. And I've had people, acquaintances, send me different articles or social media posts saying, is this a good idea? One that came across my desk a few weeks ago was a post saying we should be locking the cabinets while we're at home, with the idea that our children wouldn't eat so much. I just cringe at this, and that's just creating more food insecurity or more scarcity, and that we might be eating more if we're home more. That if we're a family that was not at home very much, and you're running around, and kids didn't have access to the kitchen, it would kind of be predictable that once they had open access to the kitchen, that they might eat more. That's just kind of common sense, honestly. But as you fall into a new routine of being at home and without restriction, then you're all going to fall into a routine with your eating. And so instead of feeling like we have to control it, what if we accepted it and kind of rolled with it and made sure everyone got the food that they needed?
Yeah. And that's such a good point too, that it's it might be a short-term thing where people are suddenly eating more because they're home and had been deprived maybe, with I think a lot of kids these days, especially with the parent, with the sort of low-level diet culture that pervades parenting, are so chronically just a little bit deprived maybe and are used to having only quote unquote healthy snacks and demonizing foods that are deemed quote unquote unhealthy. And so having, eating differently, eating more kind of shelf-stable type foods as we need to do in this time and having more access to those foods because we're home more and not running around as much might result in a short-term feeling of woohoo, yay, I finally get access to this, this swing back from the side of restriction. And that's okay. And that's normal.
It is. And as parents, our job is to provide structure and support so that our kids can learn skills over time. And so I like to equate feeding to how we help kids with bedtime. That we have more structure when they're little babies around bedtime. Like a toddler you might have a whole routine about bath and their lovey and a lullaby and 2 books, And with feeding, we do the same thing. There might be very set snack times, and the parents might decide what is for snack time. But as the children get older, they can make more and more of those decisions. And so if you're at home and a child's opening the cabinet, reaching in, and it's a young child, maybe you say, why don't you take that to the kitchen table? I'll grab some milk and we'll sit down and have snack time. Or you might say, you know what, it's not quite snack time. Well, why don't we have that with snack in about an hour or so? And so it's okay to give them structure, but what we don't want to do is say, rip it out of their hand or say, what's wrong with you for eating that? You're eating too much. You can help without creating restriction.
Yeah, creating structure doesn't have to be creating restriction.
Exactly. And I think that there's nuance there, and that's hard, especially as we all live in this culture, this diet culture.
And I think that probably people coming in from diet culture, just learning about the division of responsibility, as with anything, as the people that I work with coming in and learning about intuitive eating, it's the same kind of thing. It's like there's this tendency to turn it into a diet. There's this tendency to clamp down on the structure and sort of make it into rules. And so what do you find is helpful for letting go of that piece and not having parents turn this division of responsibility into hard and fast rules?
I really encourage parents to think about what their intention is with what they're doing. Is their intention to limit how much they're eating or to control how much they're eating? Or is their intention to, create some structure and some regularity to their eating? And if you can kind of start to question your intention, then you might be able to start to see where in your feeding is more based in diet culture. And to know that there needs to be flexibility. Ellen Satter talks about parenting styles. And, on one end is the authoritarian parent. And on the other end is the permissive parent. The authoritarian parent would say, you don't get any dessert until you eat every single green bean. And the permissive parent would say, oh, you don't like what's for dinner. Why don't you go make yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? And the goal is to be in the middle, authoritative. And so that, really looking for that, just you're providing structure. It doesn't mean that snack time has to be at 10 o'clock on the dot every day. It could be at 9:30 if everyone's hungry. It could be, you know that your child didn't eat very much for breakfast and you're really noticing they're low in energy or they're really ready to eat, then give them a snack. You get to decide.
I think that's really helpful and important to recognize too, because I think some people will interpret the division of responsibility to say meals are only at this time, snacks are only at this time. And if you're hungry in between, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with a child or it's bad. And I need to somehow make them not hungry.
Right. And that could just, like you said, could be another diet, could be another way to restrict. And so if it feels that way, then to really kind of think through, what am I doing that it feels like I'm doing something wrong? Because I really think the division of responsibility can be really empowering and decrease anxiety for parents. But if it feels like it's not working or it's creating anxiety, then we might need to look at it through a different lens.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to think about that from the perspective of people like older adults or, older people, not children, recovering from eating disorders and where they're on a meal plan or trying to do a loose sort of schedule of regular meals and snacks throughout the day and trying to eat more and eat enough. I find that when people are doing that and they're really making an effort to eat enough, but don't necessarily know what enough is, they might feel like, oh my God, I'm eating so much and yet I'm still hungry. What's wrong with me? I'm eating quote unquote so much at breakfast and morning snack, and then I'm still hungry for lunch an hour earlier than I quote unquote should be. And I think that's, again, the sign of needing to come out of diet culture and sort of having your grip loosening and starting to let go more in terms of your relationship with food, but needing more permission, not less, not needing to clamp down more, but needing to eat even more and allow even more flexibility.
Yes, I agree. And from a parenting perspective, it would be to really, really work on trusting your child's body to know, and that might mean they eat a ton at one meal or snack, or for days eat a ton, but just to know that their body knows. I'm a dietitian and I can't tell you how much my children need to eat at each meal and snack. I have to try. I put the food in front of them and I trust them, but that doesn't mean they eat the exact quote unquote right amount of food at a given time. It means that over time, their body knows what they need over time.
Yes, I love that too. I think that's another really important aspect of the division of responsibility is recognizing that it doesn't all happen in the course of one day. It's not going to look exactly the same from day to day or even week to week. Some meals your kid's just going to eat nothing but one thing, and some meals are going to eat a bigger variety, but it doesn't have to be balance of every single meal is balanced, right? It's balance over time is what really ends up happening.
Exactly. And I feel like if you could focus on that your job is to model day in and day out for years what meals and snacks look like. And so a child may eat very different at all these meals and snacks, but then at some point they're going to be an adult and they're going to kind of know what meals and snacks look like. So they can start to put together their own. But it's not, the goal as a parent is not to get a certain perfect meal or snack into a child each time you feed them, which I think is kind of the message of our culture. To be a good parent, a perfect parent is to get your child to eat the right amount of foods, the right foods.
I mean, yeah, thinking about a blog post that you wrote about COVID-19 recently, you were talking about how like one diet culture piece of advice that you've seen floating around is like putting together a snack box and saying
Yes.
like, the kid only gets to eat the snacks in this box. And like, how ridiculous is that from this, perspective of you're not trusting the child's body, you're not trusting their wisdom, their desires and intentions. And also, how can you possibly like know how much to feed your 3-year-old versus your 12-year-old or,
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And we don't know where they are in their growth spurts, or there's like so many factors we could just list. But also the message of like, we need to have this special box with these special food in it because otherwise things would just really be chaotic around here. Instead of just offering the food at appropriate times and letting them eat as much or as little as their body wants or they want at that time.
What about for parents who are struggling in their own relationships with food? Because oftentimes these things are intergenerational, like diet culture is transmitted intergenerationally, and often parents are, without any intention or malicious intent at all, sometimes are transmitting some of their fears and worries about food to their kids. And, if they realize that and want to start doing more of a division of responsibility model in their home, what are some things that parents might need to work on in their own relationship with food? And then what can they sort of expect for their kids as their kids maybe adjust to this new way of eating?
I talk with parents about any work they do about their own relationship with food and body is probably the best thing they could do for their children. And so one thing is to think about if you want to get support and help. Another thing is I love using the division of responsibility with adults, that it's kind of reparenting yourself. So if you kind of want to start to really soften, diet culture in your home or try to get diet culture out of your home, it may be to really use the division of responsibility, but you jump in there too. You're going to fix breakfast and it's going to be eggs and toast and an apple. And we're going to all sit down. And once you've done that parenting job for you and your family, take a deep breath. And then you do the child's job for yourself. You get to decide how much you're going to eat, not diet culture or not these preconceived notions. And that has been healing for a lot of people I work with, is that kind of, maybe they weren't modeled that when they were young. Maybe their parents told them how much they ate or didn't fix them foods. Maybe there was not that model of what a parent does around food. So that's kind of a neat thing that if you're feeling like you need the structure, that can be helpful.
I love that. I was actually thinking about asking that because I've had a couple clients say that they stumbled into information about the division of responsibility and they wanted to use it for themselves or had started experimenting with using it for themselves and found it really healing to think about reparenting themselves in that way.
Yeah. I think it can be just a really neat part of recovery in different levels. And I find interesting the topic of people who have really come into intuitive eating. And so they've really worked hard on getting rid of diet culture and they've really embraced intuitive eating. And then they have children that they're wanting to use the division of responsibility, and that actually feels kind of restrictive. Or they're really trying to use intuitive eating concepts with their children and they're feeling like it's not working out well, that their children need more structure. And so I think there's interesting conversation there of how it all fits together.
Yeah, for sure. I agree, because I think sometimes when using intuitive eating with kids, I've found that parents feel like they're a little helpless or something. They're like, oh my God, my kid only wants to eat cookies every single time I ask them what they want. And how do I, navigate that without creating restrictions?
Right.
What would you say to that, to someone who's struggling with that?
I would just remind them that like we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, that children's minds are different. That if we ask a child, what do you want to eat? Their mind is really different than ours. So just like if they're getting into the bathtub, we might say, do you want to play with the ball or do you want to play with the rubber ducky? Give them two choices. But saying, well, what toys do you want to play with? They might not be able to come up with anything. Or, they might think of all these things that are not even readily accessible, right?
Mhm.
And so our children don't do well with just, okay, well, what does your body want to eat right now? That because of where they are developmentally, they do better with, here's your breakfast, and let them then decide from there what their body wants, quote unquote, wants from what's on the plate. And so, that's someone who has really worked on intuitive eating, maybe working on really trying to identify what their body wants, but that might not be developmentally appropriate for their child. And that is okay to kind of make that distinction.
Right. Because that's such an important point too, that, in terms of the abstract thinking versus linear, like concrete thinking, children's brains are much more concrete and they're much more just sort of, if you give them something that's in front of them, they can make the decisions. Like their body's intuitive wisdom will kick in around how hungry they are, how much they want, when to stop eating, what tastes good, what they are wanting to partake of from what's available. But like giving them the option of making the thing available in the first place is kind of not an appropriate thing for a child to do, right? And like when you think about cultures around the world, that's really true. Is we don't generally see any cultures where the child is responsible for procuring their own food.
Right.
It's more like people are all eating together, the parents are preparing the food and serving the food, and the children are expected to just be there and eat the food, not necessarily do anything to get the food.
Yes. I feel like that developmental piece is important for us to hold on to. I think another kind of trend in our society is to give lots of responsibility to children at younger and younger ages. And I don't think that's all wrong. I don't think we should coddle our children forever either, but I think we need to remember where they are developmentally, and that it's developmentally appropriate for parents to make meals for their young children and then to allow them to decide what they're going to eat.
Yeah, and if you're sort of offering snacks, you could say, do you want cookies or goldfish? Or do you want crackers with cheese or peanut butter on celery or whatever? And like then they can make a choice from within that perspective. Or if they say something that's different and it's like, okay, well, that's something we have in the pantry and it's snack time, then you can make that call as a parent too. You don't have to necessarily, just go with what's the options are.
Absolutely.
In terms of like meals and stuff, I think it's also helpful to hear you say that, you don't have to make your child something different for a meal if they don't want to eat what's there, right? You don't have to be like, well, then here's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Let me go make that for you.
No, because I think part of our job as parents is to, what Ellen Satter calls, help them be a competent eater. And that's part of that is being able to eat foods that are presented to you, right? If you go to a friend's house, or if your child goes to college, they need to figure out how to eat in the cafeteria. And so if we're always just giving them what they want, they're not going to learn to eat different foods, right? So if we always give them the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, they're never going to learn to eat the, chicken and baked potato or whatever. And just like if we always ask them, well, what do you want to eat? They might always just go with what pops up in their mind first, and they're never going to be exposed to a wide variety of foods. And that wide variety of food can be defined as what's culturally appropriate for your family, whatever that is, whatever that food culture is in your family.
Yeah, that's so important. And I'm curious to hear how you would deal with a picky eater in that situation. Say the kid is just like, I hate chicken, or I hate, something that's like constantly on your family's table and they just will not have it. The sort of traditional dietetics model is like, well, keep at it, keep forcing them to try it, basically. And like, if you get them to try it enough, they'll eventually like it, which I think, there is something to be said for children's neophobia kicks in at a certain point where they're, afraid of and averse to new foods, or young kids will have a much greater preference for sweeter foods and less preference for bitter foods. And that changes over time as their palate develops. So, a vegetable they hated a few years ago, they might not hate anymore. They might actually like it if they tried it again. So how do you sort of navigate that, desire to help expose kids to new foods and have them have a flexible palate and enjoy lots of different kinds of foods, but also, not push them?
Right. We know that pressure doesn't work, that if we force children to eat something, it doesn't lead them to eating it later in life. If you think about, most parents can get a child, not all children, but let's say to eat a green bean at this dinner, but they're not likely to grow up to be an adult that eats green beans because they were forced to as a child. But we know that exposure over time leads to food acceptance for most people. But I really like to think about that children's personalities really shows up in how they eat. And so you might have a child that's loves new adventures, loves new situations, is really gregarious. That child might need to see a food not very many times to accept it. But you might have a child that's more cautious, that's more reserved, that really kind of has to sneak up on things. And that child might have to see chicken for years, but just, serve chicken with lots of other things on the table that is a balanced, whatever that might be in your family. And they might not eat the chicken. They might just eat the rolls and the glass of milk and some apple slices. But over time, most children will start to be able to kind of sneak up on that food. And if we can stop thinking that as a parent, my goal is to get that child to eat chicken, but more my job as a parent is to expose them to a variety of foods. That's where your job kind of ends. They're going to decide. They're kind of in charge of their own bodies as far as what goes inside their body.
And it's kind of amazing, too, how nutritionally that works out, right? Because I know, I definitely hear some parents say, but I mean, if they're not eating the chicken or whatever the food is that they're fearing, they're not getting X food group, and what if they're only eating carbs at a meal or something? And there's this, especially now with the way diet culture is, there's this especially strong prohibition on carbs, which happen to be the food that make up the bulk of a child's menu, kids are able to sort of go without certain other food groups, but, they tend to come back to the starches. So how would you talk to a parent who is fearful of that and concerned that their child's not getting enough of whatever nutrient?
That your child is going to have lots more chances to get what they need. It kind of goes back to what you and I were talking about, that if we can zoom out from one particular meal, then, there's going to be another meal coming that has that particular food group in a different form. So maybe you don't serve chicken every single meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? You might know, you're the adult, so you can think to yourself, well, Johnny doesn't like chicken very much. Maybe we serve something else. Maybe at lunch you serve something else. But it doesn't even have to be quite that calculated. That you're just serving a variety. Their body is going to get what they need over time. There's certainly exceptions to that. There are certainly different situations that are exceptions to that. But in general, and it takes a lot of patience. I'll be honest with you, I've got 3 very different eaters that they eat very, very differently, but I have a pickier eater, someone who's more on the picky side of things. And I'm always surprised when they're ready to sneak up on that food. And it often is because they're really hungry and there's not a lot of other choices, and they've seen it a million times and they think, fine, I'm going to try it. But it takes a lot of patience as a parent.
And yeah, that patience and not fighting it, not pushing the kid is probably the best way to get them to accept it, right? Because as soon as you start engaging in that fight, then it becomes not just about them and their desires and sort of, comfort and ability to sneak up on a food and, be able to accept it, but it's also now rebellion against you and your rules. Adds a whole other layer of difficulty to the mix.
Exactly. And with all I know about eating disorders, I want food to be the last thing I argue with my children about. I'll argue with them about other things, screen time or what they're wearing, but food we're not going to argue about.
Yeah. You know too much.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's so good to talk with you, Anna. I love this conversation. And can you tell people where they can find you and learn more about your work?
Absolutely. You can find me on Instagram, which is Anna Lutz RD. And then in my private practice in North Carolina you can find our website at www.lutzandalexander.com. And then I also write a blog called Sunny Side Up Nutrition, which is really about what we've been talking about. And I write that with my colleague, Elizabeth Davenport, who's a HACE dietitian in DC. We actually met at the School of Public Health. And our website is www.sunnysideupnutrition.com, and on Instagram at Sunnyside Up Nutritionists. And we've really created this. It's for families, and it's about simple cooking, family feeding, and nutrition. And we find a lot of our followers are people who have a history of disordered eating, and they're wanting to think through how they feed their children.
I love it. That's such an important resource. And
Thank you.
People really, really need that kind of information. So thank you for all the work you do. And thank you for being here. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So that is our show. Thanks again so much to Anna Lutz and Rachel Estapa for joining us on this episode. And thanks to you for listening. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. You can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is another way to help new listeners discover us and is always so appreciated. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, you can grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/245. That's christyharrison.com/245. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it now. That's christyharrison.com/book. A big thanks to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.